The founding of Vault-Tec Corporation cannot be understood as an isolated corporate success story, but rather as the product of a collapsing pre-war United States defined by paranoia, resource scarcity, political decay, and an increasingly authoritarian relationship between government and industry, where fear of nuclear annihilation became both a commercial opportunity and a tool of social control, because Vault-Tec emerged during the final decades before the Great War as a private defense contractor deeply embedded within federal planning structures, receiving massive government funding under the explicit justification of civil defense, while operating with an unusual degree of secrecy and autonomy that allowed it to shape not only the construction of the vaults themselves, but also the ideological narrative surrounding them, presenting the Vault program to the public as a last hope for human survival, while concealing its true function as a controlled experiment on human behavior, a role confirmed through terminal entries, corporate correspondence, and enclave documentation found throughout multiple canon sources. And this dual identity was enabled by the broader political environment of the time, where the United States government, weakened by decades of war profiteering, corporate lobbying, and public unrest, increasingly outsourced critical national survival functions to megacorporations that promised efficiency and innovation at the cost of ethical oversight, a trend clearly visible in the way Vault-Tec was granted sweeping authority over vault selection, population assignment, internal governance systems, and post-sealing operational control, all under the umbrella of national security, while the public-facing image of Vault-Tec relied heavily on patriotic imagery, cheerful mascots, and reassuring slogans that framed the vaults as modern marvels of engineering designed to preserve American families, values, and culture through the coming nuclear storm, an image reinforced through advertisements, educational films, and community outreach programs that emphasize safety drills, orderly evacuation, and the idea that survival itself could be engineered if citizens simply trusted the system. Yet behind this carefully curated facade, Vault-Tec's internal planning documents reveal that the corporation was never intended to save the entire population, nor even a representative sample of it, because the number of vaults constructed was vastly insufficient relative to the population, and the criteria used to select vault locations and residents were driven not by demographic equity, but by experimental necessity, a fact underscored by the existence of so-called control vaults, which were deliberately designed to function normally for the sole purpose of providing baseline data against which the outcomes of more extreme vault experiments could be measured, meaning that from its inception the Vault program was conceived not as a shelter initiative, but as a massive, longitudinal study in social engineering conducted under conditions of total isolation, absolute authority, and existential fear. And this ambition aligned closely with the interests of elements within the pre-war government that sought to ensure continuity of power after a nuclear exchange, particularly those factions that would later coalesce into the Enclave, as evidenced by shared facilities, overlapping personnel, and the planned post-war retrieval of Vault data, suggesting that Vault-Tec functioned as both a corporate partner and a proxy for deeper state interests that viewed the destruction of the old world not as an endpoint but as a reset, an opportunity to observe humanity stripped of its institutions and rebuilt according to controlled variables. And this outlook was made politically viable by the broader social climate of the late 21st century, when constant shortages, rationing, and propaganda had normalized the idea that extraordinary sacrifices were necessary for survival, eroding public resistance to invasive measures and allowing Vault-Tec to secure consent for experiments that would have been unthinkable under stable conditions, because citizens, bombarded with messaging about imminent nuclear war and foreign threats, were conditioned to accept the idea that safety required obedience, and that questioning authority was itself a risk, a mindset reinforced by government crackdowns on dissent, the militarization of domestic policing, and the framing of corporations as patriotic actors contributing to the war effort, which allowed Vault-Tec executives to operate with near total impunity as long as they delivered on the promise of preparedness, even as internal correspondence reveals that many within the company viewed the Vault dwellers not as people to be saved, but as test subjects, whose suffering was an acceptable cost in the pursuit of data, knowledge, and post-war leverage, a perspective that transformed the vaults into closed systems, where variables could be manipulated over generations, free from outside interference, and where outcomes could be harvested long after the bombs fell. Assuming the systems held, and it is crucial to understand that this was not a last-minute corruption of a noble idea, but rather the foundational logic of the Vault-Tec program, from its earliest planning stages, because the corporation's rise coincided with a period in which the United States had already abandoned many democratic safeguards in favor of expediency, secrecy, and control, allowing Vault-Tec to position itself as indispensable to national survival, while quietly redefining what survival meant, not as the preservation of existing society, but as the creation of a dataset capable of informing the reconstruction of a new one, and thus the vaults were never merely shelters, they were instruments of policy and power designed within a system that had already accepted the sacrifice of the many for the ambitions of the few, making the humanitarian narrative not just a lie but a necessary one. Because without it, the Vault program could not have existed at the scale or with the authority that it did, and when the Great War finally arrived on the 23rd of October 2077, Vault-Tec was prepared not only to seal the doors, but to begin the true work for which the vaults had been built, a work rooted in the belief that humanity could be studied, shaped, and controlled under the right conditions, a belief that would echo through the wasteland for centuries to come. The concept of the standard control vault was central to Vault-Tec's experimental methodology, yet it was deliberately obscured from both the public and most vault residents, because a control vault represented what Vault-Tec publicly claimed all vaults would be, a self-sustaining underground habitat designed to preserve a cross-section of American society in relative safety for a predetermined period before re-emergence, complete with stable life support systems, adequate food production, medical facilities, educational infrastructure, and an overseer tasked not with enforcing an experiment, but with maintaining continuity and order. And these control vaults were essential because Vault-Tec's broader program depended on comparative data, meaning that without a baseline population living under ostensibly normal conditions, the results of more extreme experiments would lack scientific context, rendering decades or centuries of observation meaningless, which is why control vaults were designed to minimize external variables and psychological stressors beyond those inherent to confinement itself, featuring balanced population demographics, clear governance protocols, functional social institutions, and vault dwellers who were not knowingly subjected to manipulation, a fact confirmed by internal documentation that explicitly distinguishes control vaults from experimental ones. Yet despite their importance, true control vaults were exceedingly rare, because Vault-Tec's primary objective was not preservation but experimentation, and every vault allocated to normal operation represented a missed opportunity to test an extreme variable, leading to a system where the majority of vaults were compromised by design, while only a handful were allowed to function as intended, a scarcity that reveals how disingenuous the humanitarian narrative truly was, and the baseline vault design itself reflected this dual purpose. Because, while publicly marketed as a marvel of civil engineering capable of supporting life for generations, the standardized vault architecture was also optimized for surveillance, containment, and control, with modular living quarters, centralized utilities, and overseer command centers that allowed for the monitoring of population behavior and the enforcement of policies with minimal resistance, all while giving the appearance of safety and order. And these designs were not arbitrary, but the result of extensive pre-war planning that assumed prolonged isolation, generational turnover, and the eventual psychological strain of underground life. Factors that Vault-Tec accounted for in control vaults by including educational systems, recreational facilities, and cultural preservation measures intended to reduce unrest and maintain a sense of normalcy. While experimental vaults often removed or altered these same features to provoke specific outcomes, making the control vaults indispensable reference points for understanding how human societies might adapt under confinement without deliberate interference. Yet even in these vaults, the illusion of normality was carefully curated, because the overseer selection process was still controlled by Vault-Tec, vault residents were still chosen through opaque criteria, and the opening timelines were still subject to corporate authority rather than resident consensus, meaning that the control condition was never entirely free of manipulation, only less extreme than others. And the very existence of control vaults also served a political function, because they allowed Vault-Tec to plausibly deny accusations of widespread abuse by pointing to vaults that genuinely succeeded, communities that emerged intact and even thrived after re-emergence, thereby reinforcing the narrative that failures elsewhere were anomalies rather than the result of intentional design. And this selective success became a cornerstone of Vault-Tec's legacy, as post-war survivors encountered functioning vaults and assumed they represented the norm rather than the exception, unaware that these vaults existed primarily to validate the suffering inflicted elsewhere. And the technical specifications of these baseline designs further illustrate their role, because control vaults were equipped with robust reactor systems, redundant life support, and stable food production capabilities intended to last for centuries if properly maintained, in contrast to experimental vaults where critical systems were intentionally flawed, overtaxed, or placed under experimental control. And this disparity underscores that Vault-Tec possessed the knowledge and resources to build humane, survivable shelters, but chose not to apply them universally, reserving them instead for a limited number of populations whose purpose was not survival for its own sake, but data integrity. And the importance of that data extended far beyond Vault-Tec itself, because it was always intended to be collected, archived, and eventually retrieved by post-war authorities, particularly those aligned with government continuity efforts, making the control vaults not just shelters but benchmarks for the future reconstruction of civilization. Benchmarks against which the failures, mutations, and collapses of experimental vault societies could be measured, categorized, and exploited. And in this way, the control vaults reveal the cold logic at the heart of the Vault program, a logic that valued human lives primarily as variables in a vast experiment, where even mercy was rationed, and normalcy itself was a controlled condition rather than a right, ensuring that when the vault doors finally opened, the world that emerged from them would carry within it the invisible imprint of Vault-Tec's design choices, shaped not by chance, but by a deliberate hierarchy of suffering and survival. Psychological and sociological experimentation formed the backbone of Vault-Tec's most pervasive and insidious vault designs. Because while biological and technological experiments could yield measurable physical results, it was the long-term manipulation of human behavior under isolation that promised the most valuable data for controlling post-war societies. And as a result, many vaults were engineered not to test survival, but to observe how communities fracture, adapt, or submit when foundational social structures are deliberately distorted, beginning with leadership manipulation, where overseers were placed into positions of absolute authority without meaningful checks or accountability, often selected for traits such as authoritarianism, instability, or ideological rigidity, creating environments where governance itself became an experimental variable, and vault residents, unaware that their leader had been chosen to provoke conflict or collapse, were forced to navigate systems where law was arbitrary, punishment was inconsistent, and trust in institutions eroded over generations, allowing Vault-Tec to study how populations respond to illegitimate power, whether through compliance, rebellion, or gradual normalization of abuse, while other vaults focused on social isolation by severing external contact entirely, or restricting internal communication between groups, dividing populations by physical barriers, schedules, or information access, thereby simulating conditions of extreme fragmentation and testing whether shared identity could survive without cohesion, a strategy that revealed how quickly misinformation, rumor, and paranoia could replace communal bonds when official channels were absent or unreliable. And population control experiments further compounded these pressures by limiting reproduction, manipulating family structures, or enforcing rigid quotas that transformed birth itself into a regulated act, turning intimacy into a political tool, and ensuring that every generation was raised under the psychological weight of scarcity and surveillance, conditions that Vault-Tec monitored meticulously through observation systems embedded throughout the vaults, systems that recorded not only compliance but emotional degradation, stress responses, and the emergence of maladaptive behaviors. And obedience was another central focus, because Vault-Tec sought to determine how far authority could be pushed before resistance emerged, leading to experiments where residents were subjected to increasingly unreasonable rules, contradictory orders, or punitive measures disconnected from actual transgressions, allowing researchers to map the thresholds at which populations either broke down or internalized oppression, often resulting in learned helplessness, where vault dwellers ceased to question authority altogether, even as conditions deteriorated. And these experiments were not short-term, but designed to unfold over decades, ensuring that psychological damage compounded across generations, with children raised in environments where fear, compliance, or social fragmentation were normalized, creating adults who could not conceive of alternative systems, a phenomenon that Vault-Tec exploited to study cultural inertia and the durability of imposed norms. And long-term mental degradation was both a measured outcome and an accepted cost, as vaults with intact life support but severe social dysfunction demonstrated that survival alone did not equate to stability, producing populations plagued by depression, violence, ritualized cruelty, or emotional numbness, outcomes documented in terminal logs, personal journals, and environmental storytelling that consistently point to deliberate design rather than accidental failure, and it is crucial to understand that these psychological experiments were not conducted in isolation but often layered together, with leadership manipulation combined with population control or social isolation paired with enforced obedience, creating complex systems where multiple stressors interacted in unpredictable ways, allowing Vault-Tec to observe not just individual responses, but emergent social phenomena such as cult formation, scapegoating, and institutionalized abuse, all within sealed environments where escape was impossible, and external morality held no authority. And the data harvested from these vaults was intended to answer fundamental questions about human governance, specifically whether stable societies required transparency, consent, and shared values, or whether order could be maintained indefinitely through fear, misinformation, and rigid hierarchy. And while the human cost of these experiments was catastrophic, resulting in countless deaths, broken communities, and generational trauma, Vault-Tec's internal logic treated these outcomes as acceptable variables, reinforcing the idea that the vaults were never meant to protect humanity as it was, but to reveal how it could be reshaped under extreme pressure, a goal that aligned with broader pre-war and post-war ambitions to engineer compliant populations capable of surviving in hostile conditions without challenging the structures imposed upon them. And thus the psychological and sociological vaults stand as some of the most damning evidence of Vault-Tec's true purpose, because they demonstrate that the greatest threat to the vault dwellers was never radiation or scarcity, but the deliberate erosion of their humanity through controlled despair, making the vault itself not a refuge but a laboratory where suffering was both the method and the measurement. Absolute control and coercion defined some of Vault-Tec's most extreme experiments, where the architecture, social systems, and leadership selection were all engineered to test how human populations react under unchallenged authority. And in these vaults, the overseer was not merely a manager, but a singular locus of power, granted unilateral control over security forces, access to essential resources, legal authority, and even life support mechanisms, ensuring that compliance was enforced rather than voluntary, while the overseers themselves were carefully chosen or conditioned to embrace authoritarianism, paranoia, and cruelty, often provided with directives designed to create moral dilemmas, pit residents against one another, or manipulate perceptions of fairness and justice, turning governance into an instrument of experimentation in domination. And the residents, cut off from the outside world, were subjected to systems in which dissent carried existential consequences, from starvation and deprivation to exile and execution, cultivating a pervasive climate of fear that became the primary mechanism for maintaining order. And the vault's design often incorporated intentional contradictions in rules, scarcity of resources, and opaque bureaucratic structures that forced overseers to make impossible choices, allowing Vault-Tec to observe how authority could be rationalized, abused, or resisted, as well as what forms of rebellion emerged, whether through secret alliances, sabotage, or silent compliance. And coercion was reinforced through environmental and social controls such as constant surveillance, mandatory schedules, enforced uniforms, and incentivized informant networks that undermined communal trust and redirected loyalty toward power rather than peers, a deliberate strategy that ensured social bonds were subordinate to authority, while ritualized discipline and indoctrination programs framed obedience as civic duty and moral virtue, conditioning generations to equate survival with submission and diminishing the possibility of organized resistance even as stress, deprivation, and moral compromise compounded over time. And the overarching goal of these experiments was to determine the durability of oppressive systems, the thresholds at which populations would collapse or internalize authoritarian norms, and whether controlled suffering could produce long-term social stability, offering insights not only into human psychology under extreme duress, but also into the potential for centralized governance in a post-apocalyptic world. And the results, meticulously documented through surveillance, logs, and environmental observation, demonstrated that while some populations could endure, obedience came at the cost of social cohesion, mental health, and ethical integrity, producing societies where fear and manipulation replaced trust and community. Outcomes that reflected the cold and calculated logic of Vault-Tec's broader agenda, which treated human lives as variables to be tested, refined, and ultimately exploited to understand the limits of control. Genetic, biological, and medical experimentation represented some of the most ethically egregious aspects of the Vault program, as Vault-Tec deliberately manipulated human life at its most fundamental level to observe how populations would respond to forced alterations, environmental stresses, and disease. And these vaults were designed with systems and protocols that subjected residents to controlled radiation exposure, chemical agents, and experimental pharmaceuticals, often without informed consent, to measure physiological changes, mutation rates, and adaptive responses, while some vaults pursued selective breeding programs intended to produce populations with particular traits, such as increased intelligence, physical resilience, or obedience, creating artificial pressures on reproduction and family structures that transformed intimate human relationships into experimental variables. And disease testing was another critical component, with Vault residents sometimes exposed to engineered pathogens or subjected to deprivation of vaccines and medical care to observe morbidity, mortality, and the social consequences of illness, a cruel form of population control that allowed Vault-Tec to collect data on the progression of disease and the interplay between health, behavior, and governance under extreme conditions. And even more invasive interventions occurred in vaults, where experimental surgeries, chemical treatments, or genetic manipulations were applied to select individuals or cohorts, creating populations with altered physiology, heightened susceptibility to certain conditions, or unexpected behavioral changes, while environmental systems such as radiation shielding, food irradiation, and water purification were calibrated to apply stress selectively, ensuring that physical and biological outcomes could be measured against specific control groups. And the ethical implications of these experiments were compounded by the isolation of the vaults, which ensured that participants had no access to external medical assistance, legal recourse, or oversight, making every biological effect the product of deliberate design rather than chance. And the data gathered from these populations was intended to inform pre-war government planning, military strategy, and post-war reconstruction, providing insight into the resilience of human biology, the limits of adaptation, and the potential for engineered populations to survive under extreme environmental pressures, while internal Vault-Tec documents reveal a willingness to sacrifice both individuals and entire cohorts for the sake of experimental integrity, framing suffering and mutation not as failures but as expected and necessary outcomes. And these experiments were often layered in complexity, combining radiation exposure with nutritional deficiencies, enforced isolation, or manipulated social hierarchies, to observe the interaction of biological and psychological stresses, producing results that extended beyond individual health to include societal collapse, altered reproductive patterns, and the emergence of maladaptive cultural practices. And despite the catastrophic human cost, some vaults yielded populations whose adaptations were recorded as successes, demonstrating the ability of human physiology to endure extreme conditions, while others collapsed entirely, providing data on failure thresholds and the limits of artificial selection. And taken together, these biological and medical vaults reveal a calculated vision of experimentation in which the survival, evolution, and mutation of humanity were treated as instruments for study, with the welfare of vault dwellers subordinated entirely to the goals of science, data collection, and the preparation of a post-war world in which controlled populations might be understood, manipulated, or exploited, showing that Vault-Tec's agenda extended far beyond shelter into the fundamental manipulation of life itself. Vaults designed around social engineering and cultural manipulation were among the most ambitious and insidious of Vault-Tec's experiments, as they sought not only to observe human behavior under isolation, but to actively shape ideology, belief systems, and moral norms within closed populations. And in these vaults, the environment, governance, education, and even daily routines were deliberately structured to enforce extreme ideologies, whether through saturation of propaganda, mandatory adherence to constructed moral codes, or the suppression of behaviors deemed undesirable, creating societies in which conformity was continuously reinforced and deviation punished. And some vaults were designed to instill collective belief in invented religions, political philosophies, or pseudo-scientific dogmas, providing Vault-Tec with unparalleled data on how humans internalize and transmit ideology over generations when insulated from competing perspectives, while other vaults manipulated cultural expression by restricting art, language, or communal traditions, ensuring that the population's creative and social output conformed to the experimental parameters, thereby observing how identity and cohesion were influenced by imposed cultural limitations, and in extreme cases, vaults enforced rigid moral structures that dictated personal relationships, work hierarchies, and even reproductive behavior, transforming social norms into experimental variables and demonstrating the profound influence of controlled environments on ethical development, while indoctrination was reinforced through continuous exposure to messaging in the form of lectures, films, educational programs, and propaganda posters, all designed to normalize the vault's ideology and to frame obedience, faith, or conformity as both virtuous and necessary for survival, and surveillance systems monitored not only compliance, but the subtle erosion of dissenting thoughts, capturing how social pressure, reward, and punishment shaped both individual psychology and collective behavior, and these experiments often combined with other variables, including resource scarcity, social isolation, or demographic manipulation, producing complex outcomes that revealed how humans adapt their cultural and moral frameworks to extreme constraints. And the results demonstrated that enforced ideology could be internalized over multiple generations, creating populations that accepted practices, beliefs, or hierarchies they would have previously resisted, while vaults where social engineering failed provided equally valuable insight into rebellion, the persistence of subversive behaviors, and the conditions under which communities resist imposed norms. And the ethical implications of these experiments were profound, as entire populations were subjected to manufactured belief systems with no opportunity for informed consent or escape, highlighting that the true purpose of these vaults was not survival, but the collection of data on human malleability, cultural transmission, and the capacity for societies to internalize values under extreme control. And in this way, Vault-Tec's social engineering vaults reveal the corporation's broader philosophy, one in which human behavior, morality, and culture were tools to be manipulated, tested, and recorded, demonstrating a calculated attempt to understand not merely how people could survive the nuclear apocalypse, but how they could be reshaped to fit the precise vision of a post-war society dictated by the architects of the Vault program. Some vaults were designed to explore the intersection of human survival and technological control, serving as experiments in how automation, artificial intelligence, and mechanized systems could govern populations in isolation. And in these environments, Vault-Tec replaced or augmented traditional governance structures with machines capable of enforcing rules, managing resources, and monitoring compliance with a level of consistency impossible for humans, creating societies in which authority was exercised not by overseers, but by programmed systems whose directives were immutable and whose presence was inescapable. And in many cases, these AI-driven vaults functioned as experiments in social adaptation, testing how populations reacted when decisions about rationing, punishment, or resource allocation were mediated by algorithms rather than human judgment, revealing both the efficiency and rigidity of automated governance, as well as the psychological effects of living under impersonal authority, while some vaults employed robots not merely as tools, but as intermediaries of control, including patrol units, automated enforcers, and service machines programmed to prioritize system directives over individual welfare, producing environments where human initiative was curtailed and dependence on technology became absolute, and these systems allowed Vault-Tec to observe patterns of obedience, innovation, subversion, and despair as humans interacted with mechanical overseers, testing the limits of trust, adaptability, and compliance under conditions where failure to follow programmed rules could result in immediate consequences, while simultaneously capturing extensive behavioral and operational data that informed broader theories about automated governance and post-war societal stability. And the technological experiments were not limited to AI governance, but extended to environmental manipulation, such as automated climate controls, food production systems, and security measures designed to test how humans respond to highly managed living conditions, as well as integrated monitoring networks that tracked movement, health, communication, and social interaction, providing an unprecedented level of insight into the ways technology could both stabilize and destabilize human communities. And in some vaults, the combination of artificial intelligence and mechanized enforcement created closed feedback loops, where human behavior shaped machine responses, and machine responses further shaped human behavior, resulting in emergent social dynamics that revealed both the potential and the limitations of relying on technology as a substitute for leadership and moral judgment. And these experiments also highlighted the ethical implications of delegating life and death decisions to machines, demonstrating how populations subjected to rigid automated control could experience psychological stress, social fragmentation, and loss of agency, while those who adapted often exhibited increased compliance, ingenuity in circumventing restrictions, or the creation of informal human hierarchies to negotiate the machine-imposed order. And the data collected from these technological vaults informed not only Vault-Tec's understanding of human behavior, but also pre-war planning for centralized control, resource management, and post-war reconstruction, offering a blueprint for a society in which technology could act as both stabilizing and coercive force, showing that in Vault-Tec's conception, the survival of human populations was inseparable from their manipulation through artificial systems, and that the same structures that could preserve life could just as easily impose suffering, obedience, and dehumanization, making these vaults some of the most revealing demonstrations of the interplay between humanity and the technological apparatus designed to control it. Population imbalance and demographic manipulation were central to some of Vault-Tec's most methodical experiments, as certain vaults were deliberately constructed with skewed age distributions, gender ratios, or even selective traits to observe how human societies might evolve under unnatural reproductive and social pressures. And in these environments, residents faced conditions that were engineered to provoke both biological and social consequences, such as vaults with overwhelmingly male or female populations designed to test mating behaviors, fertility management, and the impact of sexual scarcity or surplus on social cohesion, while others were organized around single-trait populations, where residents shared physical characteristics, intelligence levels, or psychological tendencies, allowing Vault-Tec to study the long-term effects of homogeneity and the emergence of adaptive or maladaptive cultural practices. And in some cases, demographic manipulation extended to artificially imposed age hierarchies, where populations were intentionally limited to certain generations or age brackets, creating communities in which elder knowledge was absent or youth leadership was forced, testing how experience, mentorship, and generational continuity influenced governance, survival strategies, and cultural transmission, while reproductive control was often enforced through policy, coercion, or environmental limitations, including restrictions on pairing, artificial fertility interventions, or social engineering programs that incentivized or punished reproductive behaviors, producing measurable outcomes in population stability, social tension, and adaptive ingenuity. And these vaults provided data not only on human adaptability under constrained circumstances, but also on the potential for engineered populations to either stabilize or collapse, revealing thresholds for cooperation, conflict, and emergent hierarchies, as well as the mechanisms by which populations cope with unnatural social distributions. And Vault-Tec monitored both behavioral and physiological effects through extensive surveillance, documenting stress responses, mental health decline, conflict, and the formation of informal governance systems as residents adapted to the imposed conditions, while also recording fertility patterns, child development, and generational changes to understand how long-term isolation and demographic pressure shaped the human life cycle. And the results of these experiments illustrated that while certain populations could achieve functional stability, the imposed imbalances often produced profound social strain, leading to aggression, scapegoating, psychological trauma, or the emergence of subcultures that resisted central control, highlighting both the resilience and vulnerability of human communities when subjected to engineered population structures. And the knowledge gained from these demographic vaults informed Vault-Tec's broader agenda by demonstrating that manipulation of fundamental social and biological variables could reliably shape behavior and culture, providing insight into post-war population planning, control, and the long-term consequences of artificially imposed social hierarchies, confirming that in Vault-Tec's methodology, the composition of the population itself was as much a variable to be tested as the environmental or psychological conditions in which it lived, and that human survival could be engineered not only through shelter and resources, but through careful, deliberate management of the very people who were meant to inhabit it. Some vaults failed catastrophically, not as a result of accident, but because Vault-Tec intentionally designed systems that tested the limits of human resilience, infrastructure, integrity, and social cohesion under extreme stress. And in these environments, the combination of flawed engineering, manipulated governance, and imposed environmental hazards often led to mechanical breakdowns, resource depletion, and systemic collapse, while internal revolts, mutinies, and violent confrontations emerged as predictable outcomes of conditions engineered to provoke desperation and conflict, demonstrating the precise calculus behind Vault-Tec's approach to experimentation, because failure itself was a measurable and valuable result, providing insights into thresholds of survival, breakdown, and human adaptation. And in many instances, external breaches compounded these failures, whether through vault doors that could not withstand structural stress, environmental sealing mechanisms that malfunctioned, or the intrusion of radiation and contamination when containment systems proved inadequate, creating scenarios in which residents were exposed to lethal hazards that amplified the consequences of social and psychological stress, while the corporation meticulously recorded every outcome to correlate specific design decisions, leadership selection, and environmental manipulation with the resultant collapse, establishing a database of catastrophic outcomes that could be compared to control vaults and other experimental populations. And these failures ranged from immediate, acute disasters in newly sealed vaults to slow, generational deterioration in long-term experiments, illustrating how both rapid and prolonged stresses could destabilize communities, while producing data on mortality rates, resource management failures, behavioral adaptation, and the emergence of informal hierarchies or survival strategies. And even when catastrophic outcomes were mitigated by temporary human ingenuity or chance, the long-term impact on population health, social cohesion, and psychological stability was profound, often rendering survivors incapable of rebuilding functional societies without external intervention. And the lessons drawn from these vaults informed Vault-Tec's broader understanding of human limits, revealing not only the minimum conditions required to sustain life, but also the points at which social systems, governance, and technology fail under duress. And in many ways, these catastrophic vaults serve as a grim testament to the calculated cruelty of the program, because they demonstrate that the corporation treated failure not as a moral failing, but as a tool, a way to map the boundaries of human endurance and design future experiments. And the data harvested from these disasters was intended to inform pre-war contingency planning, post-war population management, and the construction of additional vaults, ensuring that every collapse contributed to an evolving model of controlled survival, where the lives, suffering, and even deaths of vault dwellers were variables in a vast, centuries-spanning study of human resilience under conditions of engineered catastrophe, highlighting the deliberate and systemic nature of Vault-Tec's experimentation and the degree to which failure itself was integrated into the overarching design of the Vault program. Some vaults deviated from Vault-Tec's intended timelines by opening early or otherwise failing to adhere to their scheduled periods of isolation, and these deviations created unique social and environmental consequences that provided the corporation with unplanned yet invaluable data, because the sudden exposure to the irradiated wasteland forced populations to confront challenges for which they were neither physically nor psychologically prepared, often leading to chaos, fragmentation, or adaptation on accelerated timescales. While the causes of early openings varied, including mechanical failure, human error, sabotage, or deliberate intervention, and in each case, the results allowed Vault-Tec to observe how vault dwellers coped with premature re-entry into the post-war world, testing resilience, resourcefulness, and the ability to establish order under unplanned conditions. And in some vaults, the early opening exacerbated pre-existing internal tensions, accelerating leadership struggles, social breakdown, and conflict between factions within the population, while in others, it forced rapid collaboration and the emergence of adaptive strategies that would not have been necessary under controlled timelines, highlighting the influence of environmental stress and timing on social evolution. And the surrounding wasteland also played a critical role in shaping outcomes, because vaults located near hostile territories, irradiated zones, or rival factions exposed populations to additional external pressures, from violent encounters and territorial disputes to resource scarcity and exposure to disease, all of which compounded the effects of premature opening. And these events provided insight into the interplay between vault design, human behavior, and environmental hazards, revealing how isolation and preparation interacted with real-world contingencies, while also demonstrating the limits of Vault-Tec's predictive models, because even meticulously planned vaults were vulnerable to unanticipated failures, demonstrating that human and mechanical variables could not be fully controlled. And the data collected from these early openings influenced subsequent experimental design, offering lessons on how populations respond to sudden environmental change, the capacity for rapid adaptation, and the consequences of disrupted developmental timelines. while also informing post-war strategies for integrating Vault populations into broader societal networks, whether through resettlement, resource allocation, or continued surveillance. And these deviations underscore a central truth of the Vault program, that survival was not only measured by the ability to endure confinement, but also by the capacity to confront the unplanned, the uncontrolled, and the emergent, revealing human resilience, ingenuity, and fragility in ways that meticulously timed experiments could not. And the legacy of early or off-schedule openings continues to shape the wasteland, as populations thrust into the irradiated world often became catalysts for regional change, spreading technology, knowledge, or conflict beyond the Vault's original boundaries. And in this way, these Vaults serve as both cautionary examples of the fragility of artificial systems and instructive case studies in how populations respond when the carefully imposed parameters of survival are disrupted, highlighting the dynamic interaction between human agency, environmental pressure, and the engineered frameworks of Vault-Tec's overarching experiment. Some Vaults succeeded beyond expectations, emerging as rare examples where populations not only survived isolation, but adapted to the constraints of their environment in ways that allowed them to maintain cohesion, rebuild functional societies, and even influence the post-war world. And in these cases, Vault-Tec's designs, whether intentionally benign or minimally experimental, provided sufficient resources, balanced social structures, and functional governance to sustain life over multiple generations, allowing Vault dwellers to develop stable communities with cultural continuity, practical knowledge, and social resilience, while the overseers and inhabitants learned to navigate the challenges of confinement without the extreme manipulations present in more experimental Vaults, resulting in populations that demonstrated effective problem-solving, cooperation, and innovation in areas such as food production, sanitation, education, and conflict resolution. And these successes were meticulously documented by Vault-Tec, not only to provide a baseline for comparative analysis, but also to demonstrate that the corporation possessed the technical and organizational capacity to preserve human interviews, life, under the right conditions, reinforcing the narrative of Vaults as protective shelters, while simultaneously providing empirical evidence for the company's broader hypotheses about human adaptability, social cohesion, and the limits of environmental stress. And in some instances, these successful Vaults became foundations for post-war settlements, as their inhabitants emerged into the wasteland equipped with skills, leadership experience, and technological knowledge that allowed them to establish new towns, trade networks, and governance structures, influencing regional power dynamics and contributing to the rebuilding of society in ways that Vault-Tec had not explicitly intended but could still observe as part of the experimental dataset, while other successes were measured in less tangible ways, such as the preservation of cultural norms, language, and identity, demonstrating that under conditions of moderate stress and functional social design, populations could maintain continuity and resilience across generations. And these outcomes provided important counterpoints to the catastrophic and extreme Vaults, highlighting the interplay between environmental stability, social design, and human ingenuity, while also revealing the thresholds at which populations could thrive rather than merely survive, and even when external hazards such as radiation, resource scarcity, or hostile neighboring factions challenged these communities, the populations often adapted with remarkable flexibility, employing technological improvisation, cooperative labor, and strategic diplomacy to overcome threats, creating durable societies capable of influencing the broader post-war landscape. And these Vaults stand as testament to the fact that while Vault-Tec's primary agenda was experimentation, When the variables were managed in a balanced fashion, human populations could endure, adapt, and flourish, producing insights into social stability, long-term governance, and the potential for humanity to rebuild itself even after total devastation, offering a rare vision of success that contrasted sharply with the suffering and collapse experienced in the majority of vaults, and underscoring the complex legacy of the Vault program, which combined scientific rigor, calculated cruelty, and the occasional demonstration that life under controlled conditions could indeed result in enduring, functional human societies. Regional vault patterns across the former United States reveal how Vault-Tec tailored its experiments to the geographic, cultural, and political conditions of different areas, resulting in vaults that varied widely in design, population, and purpose, depending on whether they were located on the West Coast, East Coast, Midwest, or Appalachia, and these variations reflected both practical considerations, such as local geology, climate, and resource availability, and experimental priorities, as Vault-Tec often selected variables that would interact with regional characteristics to produce distinct social, technological, or biological outcomes. And on the West Coast, vaults frequently emphasized technological innovation and integration with pre-war industry, using sophisticated life support systems, automated governance, and advanced monitoring to explore the interaction between human behavior and mechanized control. While in the East Coast, particularly around the capital wasteland and the Commonwealth, vaults often combined psychological and sociological experiments with strong ideological manipulation, reflecting regional proximity to political and military centers and the corporation's interest in testing populations under pressure from both isolation and pre-existing cultural expectations. And in the Midwest, vaults frequently focused on demographic and biological variables, such as population imbalance, selective breeding, and resistance to radiation and environmental hazards, exploiting the region's industrial infrastructure and pre-war research facilities to monitor long-term adaptation and survival under extreme stress. While Appalachia, as represented in Fallout 76, offered opportunities to combine environmental challenges with sociological experiments, leveraging rugged terrain, resource scarcity, and isolation to observe how populations would develop informal governance structures, trade networks, and communal survival strategies when standard oversight was limited. And within each region, Vault-Tec also accounted for cultural and social differences, recognizing that populations from different areas would respond differently to authority, propaganda, or social engineering, with the result that even similar experimental protocols produced divergent outcomes depending on regional context. And these patterns extended to architectural design as well, with vaults incorporating local materials, regional construction techniques, and environmental adaptations, ensuring that both mechanical resilience and human behavior were influenced by location-specific variables, while internal communications between vaults and corporate headquarters allowed Vault-Tec to compare results across regions, identifying trends in human adaptability, governance, efficacy, and social cohesion under varying conditions. And the regional distribution of vaults also intersected with strategic pre-war considerations, such as proximity to military installations, industrial centers, and population hubs, which informed the corporation's decisions about population selection, experimental focus, and resource allocation, producing a layered network of experiments that collectively provided a national-scale dataset on human behavior, biology, and societal organization, while simultaneously embedding regional differences that revealed the influence of geography, culture, and environment on the outcomes of Vault-Tec's interventions. And these findings underscored that the Vault program was not monolithic but highly contextual, with regional patterns shaping the very nature of the experiments, demonstrating that survival, adaptation, and societal development in the vaults were inseparable from the broader environmental and cultural landscapes in which they were placed, and that post-war recovery, conflict, and governance would inevitably reflect these regional experimental legacies, leaving distinct marks on the social and political evolution of the wasteland across the former United States. Vault-Tec's relationship with the Enclave and pre-war government continuity reveals the broader strategic purpose behind the Vault program, as the corporation was never merely constructing shelters but generating data intended to inform post-war governance and population control, and this relationship was formalized through contracts, shared personnel, and overlapping infrastructure, with the Enclave relying on Vault-Tec to create controlled populations whose outcomes could be studied and, if necessary, manipulated to suit the objectives of those planning for survival and reconstruction, while the vaults themselves were often designed to produce specific societal models, testing variables such as obedience, resource management, ideological conformity, and technological adaptation, all of which could later inform the policies, hierarchy, and operational strategies of a reconstituted government, and the pre-war government maintained a vested interest in the integrity of these experiments, recognizing that the preservation of human knowledge, expertise, and compliant populations would be critical to any attempt at continuity after a nuclear exchange, while Vault-Tec's internal records demonstrate that the corporation understood the strategic value of its work beyond commercial or scientific interests, deliberately collecting detailed observations, genetic data, psychological profiles, and social metrics to be retrieved and analyzed by authorized post-war authorities, particularly those aligned with Enclave priorities, and in some cases, Vault designs were tailored to produce populations compatible with envisioned post-war administrative or military needs, including individuals with specialized technical skills, ideological alignment, or adaptive traits suited for reconstruction or enforcement of continuity plans, while communication with Enclave planners and federal agencies ensured that these designs were consistent with broader national objectives, even if individual Vault overseers and residents were unaware of their roles within this larger strategy, and the coordination extended to operational procedures, such as opening protocols, resource allocation, and surveillance measures, ensuring that data collection would serve both corporate and governmental purposes, and in the event of catastrophic failure or unplanned exposure, Vault-Tec anticipated that the remaining populations could still be incorporated into continuity strategies, either as managed settlements, controlled labor forces, or subjects of ongoing observation, while the Enclave's interest in these outcomes highlights the degree to which the Vault program was intertwined with state-level planning, not simply as a humanitarian measure, but as an instrument of power, control, and post-war reconstruction, and the long-term implications of this relationship are evident in the way certain Vault populations influenced regional power structures, contributed knowledge and technology to surviving factions, or became strategic assets for centralized authorities, demonstrating that Vault-Tec's work was designed not only to study survival, but to produce populations whose utility extended beyond mere existence, serving as building blocks for a controlled and monitored reconstitution of society, and the archives, logs, and recovered data from Vaults consistently confirm that the corporation viewed every aspect of resident behavior, health, and social organization as valuable intelligence for post-war governance, highlighting a deliberate and enduring connection between corporate experimentation, governmental planning, and the creation of a future in which control over human populations could be exercised with unprecedented precision. ensuring that the Vault program functioned as both a laboratory and a strategic instrument of continuity, with the ultimate aim of shaping the human survivors of the apocalypse according to the vision and priorities of those who had orchestrated their confinement and observation. The long-term legacy of the Vault experiments on the wasteland is evident in the enduring social, technological, and cultural consequences experienced by post-war populations, as former Vault dwellers carried with them not only the knowledge and skills necessary for survival, but also the psychological scars, altered social norms, and behavioral adaptations imposed by decades of controlled isolation and manipulation, and the technology, architecture, and infrastructure of the vaults themselves became catalysts for regional development, scavenging, and conflict, with functioning systems such as life support, water purification, and power generation influencing settlement patterns and economic opportunities, while the failures of other vaults served as cautionary examples, spreading knowledge of the dangers inherent in poorly designed or catastrophically managed experiments. And in many regions, former Vault residents became foundational members of emerging communities, bringing expertise in governance, engineering, and resource management that shaped local politics, trade networks, and military capabilities, even as the social and psychological imprint of Vault-Tec's manipulations persisted, manifesting in heightened distrust, rigid hierarchies, cultural rituals, or authoritarian tendencies that could influence entire settlements. And the broader wasteland was shaped by these legacies as well, because Vault technology, experimental outcomes, and displaced populations interacted with external factions, mutated creatures, and environmental hazards, producing dynamic feedback loops in which the successes, failures, and peculiarities of Vault experiments contributed to ongoing patterns of conflict, cooperation, and adaptation, while the cumulative data gathered by Vault-Tec, whether preserved or lost, had implications for emergent post-war governance models, influencing how groups approach survival, organization, and the management of scarce resources. And these long-term effects were not uniform, varying according to the original design of the Vault, regional conditions, and the manner in which populations adapted to both internal and external pressures. Yet a consistent theme across the wasteland is the enduring impact of forced social engineering, demographic manipulation, technological dependence, and psychological conditioning, which shaped human behavior and societal development in ways that extended far beyond the confines of the vaults themselves, affecting trade, politics, culture, and even ethical norms. And while some vault dwellers successfully integrated into broader post-war society, preserving knowledge, skills, and cooperative institutions, others propagated dysfunction, conflict, or maladaptive behaviors, demonstrating the long reach of Vault-Tec's interventions and the complex interplay between engineered environments and human agency, and the physical remnants of the vaults, including partially functioning machinery, experimental records, and structural designs, continue to influence scavenging practices, settlement planning, and factional strategy, providing tangible evidence of pre-war experimentation that informs contemporary decision-making, survival strategies, and power dynamics. And together these factors reveal that the legacy of the Vault program is both concrete and psychological, shaping not only the material landscape of the wasteland, but the ways in which human populations perceive authority, trust, cooperation, and adaptation, ensuring that the consequences of Vault-Tec's manipulations resonate centuries after the Great War, and that the human story of the wasteland cannot be disentangled from the calculated experiments conducted beneath the surface, as every surviving Vault, functioning system, and societal anomaly bears witness to the enduring influence of the Vaults on post-war civilization. Vault-Tec's ultimate objective and moral legacy remain some of the most controversial and revealing aspects of the corporation's history. Because while the public narrative presented the Vaults as humanitarian shelters designed to preserve families and communities in the event of nuclear war, every piece of internal documentation, experimental log, and recovered record indicates that the true purpose was far more calculated and far-reaching, centering on the systematic observation, manipulation, and control of human populations under conditions of extreme isolation, engineered stress, and deliberate deprivation, and this duality between advertised purpose and covert agenda reflects a corporate philosophy that treated human lives as data points, where survival was secondary to the pursuit of knowledge, social modeling, and post-war strategic advantage, while the moral implications of these experiments are underscored by the sheer scale and diversity of manipulation, from psychological conditioning and social engineering to demographic control, genetic experimentation, and technological domination, all designed to observe human adaptability, obedience, and resilience, and the corporation's vision extended beyond mere observation, encompassing pre-war collaboration with governmental continuity programs and the Enclave, ensuring that the information generated within the vaults could be used to guide post-war reconstruction, population control, and governance, effectively linking corporate experimentation to long-term strategies for power and societal engineering. And while some vaults achieved what could be interpreted as benevolent outcomes, providing populations with the resources, knowledge, and social stability necessary to survive and even thrive after re-emergence, these successes were exceptions rather than the rule, carefully documented as controls or benchmarks against which more extreme experimental outcomes could be measured, and the majority of vaults, intentionally designed to fail, manipulate, or degrade, produced populations subjected to suffering, trauma, and social disintegration, highlighting a moral calculus in which human cost was subordinated entirely to experimental utility, a calculus that has led to enduring debates about Vault-Tec's ethical responsibility, the value of scientific knowledge obtained through coercion, and the legitimacy of applying such knowledge in a post-apocalyptic context. And the ultimate legacy of the Vault program is thus twofold. Materially, through surviving Vault technology, infrastructure, and human capital that shaped post-war settlement, trade, and governance, and psychologically, through the imprint left on survivors' behavior, social organization, cultural norms, and moral frameworks, which continue to influence wasteland society long after the Great War. And, in evaluating Vault-Tec's objective, it becomes clear that the corporation never prioritized the preservation of humanity as an end in itself, but rather its capacity to control, predict, and manipulate human behavior under extreme conditions, treating survival, morality, and community as variables in a calculated experiment designed to ensure that when civilization emerged from the nuclear ashes, it would do so along lines defined by those who had orchestrated its confinement and observation, and in this sense, Vault-Tec's moral legacy is inseparable from its methods, reflecting a vision of humanity as both resilient and malleable, capable of enduring unimaginable conditions yet perpetually subject to control, and the consequences of this vision continue to resonate as the inhabitants of the wasteland, their societies, and the very fabric of post-war civilization bear witness to the corporation's profound influence, demonstrating that the Vault program was as much a test of ethics, governance, and human endurance as it was a shelter, and that the lessons of Vault-Tec extend far beyond survival, revealing enduring truths about power, experimentation, and the costs of attempting to shape humanity according to a calculated design.